keep losing my headphones here. All right, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Clementine Thomas, and I am the owner of Bold Fork Books here in Washington, D.C. We're DC's only dedicated cookbook store, and we carry a diverse array of cookbooks, food writing, food magazines, used cookbooks, beverage books, a little bit of everything. This shop is currently open for in-person browsing, or you can find us online at boldforkbooks.com. I could not be more excited to introduce Hsiao-Ching Chou, who is joining us from Seattle in the other Washington, to talk about her fabulous new book, Vegetarian Chinese Soul Food. Hsiao-Ching is a former food editor of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, and in addition to her current work in communications in the biomedical research field, she also teaches Chinese home cooking at schools across the Seattle area. Hsiao-Ching is also on the James Beard Foundation Awards Committee, and as if all of that were not enough, she has also found the time to write two truly wonderful cookbooks. The first, Chinese Soul Food, was published in 2018, and the second we'll be talking about today. Hsiao-Ching is joined in conversation by acclaimed local chef and restaurateur, Tim Ma. Tim opened his first DC area restaurant, Maple Ave, in 2009, and truly has not slowed down since. Tim is currently the executive chef at American Sun at the Eaton Hotel and of Prathers on the Alley in Mount Vernon Square here in DC. He's also the culinary director of Lao Ben Dumplings and most recently launched Lucky Danger, a really amazing Chinese American takeout concept that he'll be telling us a little bit more about later on. So just a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we get started. We'll start with the conversation and then move into a cooking demo. Hsiao-Ching is going to show us how to make the dry fried Brussels sprouts recipe from her book. And then we'll close with the Q&A. So there'll be plenty of time for everybody's questions. We do ask that everybody stay muted today, but if you have questions, which are strongly encouraged, just drop them into the chat. We'll be monitoring and we'll do our best to get to everybody. Lastly, this event is free, but you can support us and support the event by purchasing your copy of Vegetarian Chinese Soul Food through the shop. We also have copies available of Hsiao-Ching's first book, Chinese Soul Food, so do not miss out. Thank you all so much for taking some time out of your Sunday to join us. It's really nice to be in community with you all, even if it is virtually. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Tim and Hsiao-Ching.
Thanks, Clementine. Hi, Hsiao-Ching. How's it going?
Hi, Tim. Great. I'm still looking forward to this conversation.
Also, is this your home kitchen?
It is.
Because that's
I only have one kitchen. I don't work in a restaurant anymore.
Yeah.
That was a long, long time ago. Yeah.
It looks better than some of my restaurant kitchens for sure. So I really wanted to begin the talk by talking about your background a little bit, because that's I actually have a very similar background to you, and my family's actually, my mom's from Henan and my dad's family is from Hebei. And I understand you have some family from Henan too. So I wanted to just kind of, if you can go over your journey getting here to America and where we are right now.
Sure. It's both of my parents were born in mainland China, but then because of the communists, they had to flee with their families and fled to Taiwan. And so my parents grew up in Taiwan, and I was actually born in Taipei. And then we decided to move to the United States. And so I grew up in the United States. But what brought us here really was both my parents were professionals and academics back in Taipei. My father was a career military man and had decided that he wanted to get a master's degree in journalism. By then, my mom had already gotten her master's degree in journalism from the University of Missouri School of Journalism, which is one of the best in the country. And so they decided that they would move the entire family. So I have two younger brothers, but the youngest was actually born in the United States. And then the middle brother was also born in Taipei. So that's how we ended up in the States. And then typical immigrant story, they couldn't do what they did and found themselves in the restaurant business. Had zero experience with that, but where there's a will, there's a way. So I then grew up in the restaurant business. That's kind of the shorter version.
Yeah, that's interesting. My parents kind of the same way, and that explains your journalism now. My parents were a computer science major and a biomedical engineer who met at the University of Arkansas, and both are cooking. So what's that to say about family backgrounds?
I mean, food is such a big part of our culture in general. It's not about, are you a foodie or not a foodie? It's just, food is just part of your life, right? We don't separate that. It's pretty integrated.
How do you see your perception of Chinese food in America at this point? So as going through both of your cookbooks, which are fascinating, I see like almost sometimes a mixture. Like you talk about dishes like kung pao chicken, but you also talk about dishes that like I would grow up eating at home that you only see in home kitchens. And so like as we were opening Lucky Danger, we were going through the exploration of how Chinese food has changed and how it is different here in America, rather than what it is when you see in Taiwan or China. When writing these cookbooks, what is your perception of Chinese food in America right now?
That's a very layered question. There is the what the public thinks of, broadly speaking, as Chinese food, and that has a lot to do with kind of the mom and pop takeout restaurants or chains. It could be national chains or it could be just the corner restaurant, and a lot of that has to do with the takeout foods, mostly a lot of Americanized items that people really love. And then there's this kind of that broad expectation of what that is. And then there are the dishes that are on the so-called secret menus, the ones where if you are Chinese and you go in, you can read the board or you get a different menu, literally, that has dishes that are a little bit more traditional, that maybe don't translate well, language-wise don't translate well for just the average, American consumer. Doesn't mean that they wouldn't appreciate it, but it's hard to make them sound delicious because it's a different, the language is different. So there's those types of dishes. And then there's what I like to call home style Chinese. And that is, you take the basic principles of what we do with cooking and then, apply it to the ingredients that you have on hand. So for my books, it was about recognizing some of these foods that recognized foods that many of us grew up eating, but also a little bit of variation just because of where I grew up, the circumstances, the ingredients that I've had available to me. And then at least in the first book, there is a whole chapter on what I call guilty pleasures. And those were some of the more Americanized Chinese dishes that we served in our restaurant. And our restaurant was in Columbia, Missouri. So middle of the country, middle of the state. You can imagine that people wanted things like sweet and sour pork and the cream cheese crab rangoon with the fake crab in it and stuff like that. So, my recipes tend to be, there is a little bit of a mix. It's not of any one region. And there is acknowledgement that I live in the United States and I have the ingredients that are accessible to me. And over the years, that certainly has grown with what Asian markets are able to bring into the country. or what farmers are able and willing to grow. So that has evolved over time. But yeah, that's kind of, it's a mix because there's a lot of different influences driving it.
Yeah, you touched on something interesting. My family's from Taiwan as well, and Taiwan ended up being where everybody immigrated to during the revolution in 49, which is when my parents were born. And so I guess the inspiration for some of your recipes, I see it dotted throughout the cookbook, is taking from regions all around China, but mainly because that's what Taiwan was. It was this island of immigrants, and the food scene there now is incredible, but also like a lot of what you see in American cuisine is a function of that, which I think is fascinating. I think you touch on that in some of your books.
Yeah,
So
there's definitely a through line, right? There's the origin, and then there's Taiwanese cooking and the cuisine that has risen from native Taiwanese as well. So it's an amalgamation for sure.
Yeah, and now we're seeing the American influence on Chinese food too, and so
Sure.
that's the recipes as we go. So now it is a big hodgepodge. All right, can we jump into your first book for a second for those who haven't read it? Because I started there, which was fascinating, Chinese soul food. Oh, I see that you spend a lot of time actually in both books in the front of it talking and like setting the stage, talking about ingredients and then talking about equipment a lot. And I think you speak about this in the perception of how difficult Chinese food is, and like that barrier of entry tends to be too overbearing for people to overcome. Can you speak about that a little bit and how the actual end result and what you experienced was actually how the guests were surprised by how easy it was?
Yeah, so I think that there's, over the course of the history of Chinese in the United States, I mean, there's been this I can't even say the word, exoticization of making it exotic, just making it seem like it's something that is, it's the Far East, it's something that, is different. And so if you start from that perspective, then everything and all the ingredients are therefore it builds a barrier, right? It makes it less accessible to people. And then that carries through to Asian markets where, everything is, there's, things have different languages on them, and you can't easily tell what, what the differences are of some of the ingredients. And then a lot of the, there's some books or some, food media, like they perpetuate that, that notion. It's hard sometimes to get people to understand that at the end of the day, these ingredients aren't as exotic as you think, and the techniques, once you get exposed to them, aren't as hard as you think, right? And they look at, I think in general, it's not just for Asian recipes, but if you look at a list of ingredients and there are more than X number of ingredients, it looks overwhelming and it looks like it's not achievable. And sometimes, and that's the point of teaching and point of having a cookbook like this is to have that on-ramp into day-to-day Chinese home cooking, right? So once you show people and break things down, it takes away some of that mystery. And that's really what my intent was with my books. Because there are plenty of really amazing, comprehensive Chinese cookbooks out there written by many of my friends, in fact, and the scholarship on those is incredible. But if you're just getting into this kind of cooking, that can be overwhelming, right? So I wanted to have something that was very practical and just, you can just open a page and if you just read read the recipe. You can probably cook your way through it. And I also give people permission to substitute things and adapt for their particular circumstances, because it's easy for us to say, well, a stir fry is most traditionally done in a wok, and here's what a wok looks like, and here are all the tools. But if you're trying to welcome more people into this kind of cooking, you have to allow that everybody is at a different place within how they cook and what their kitchens are like, and you know, what's the shortest distance to bringing them in, and then show them the way, and then let them kind of come to it at their own pace. So for me, it's just creating a space for meeting people where they are, and helping them enjoy this type of cooking.
I see that throughout both cookbooks, you're actually very forgiving in terms of substitutions, and like, okay, we should, you could do this if you don't have this available and things like that, which I think is really good at lowering that barrier, which I'm sure a lot of people appreciate.
Can I pause just 1 second? Clementine, it looks like you've got Tim on Spotlight. So I don't know if people can actually see me when I'm talking. Just want to make sure that it's actually turning.
I think we're good. I think.
Oh, okay. All right, cool. All right, great. Just checking. Thank you. Because I can only see one thing, so I just wanted to make sure that was good. Sorry for the interruption there.
No.
Nobody wants to see me in my hoodie and sit down and
hey.
So my next question is, and this is more a curious question for myself, because as a chef, I always have to figure out how to get inspiration. Where was the inspiration for a lot of your recipes in either cookbook?
So there are many recipes that I think are familiar to any Chinese person who has grown up on home cooking. Dumplings, of course, everybody knows dumplings. You know, there are a lot of those types of familiar dishes. And then there are some dishes that are things that somehow my mom would make. So it's stuff that I grew up eating. They may or may not have been common across our culture, but there's some of the home style stuff that I really enjoyed, and there's some recipes that we did in the restaurant. And what I tried to do for the books was to not do restaurant technique, right? So at home, just as an example, when you're in the restaurant, you have these massive woks, and you have the capability to do what we call oil blanching. That's the translation, but instead of blanching in water, you actually fill your giant wok on 150,000 BTUs with, it's giant vat of oil, and you quickly blanch your ingredients. Well, for me to do that at home would be ridiculous. It's a lot of oil. It's dangerous. So I've adapted some of those techniques for the home kitchen. And, like, it's easy to make a barbecued pork in a Chinese style barbecue oven. Well, I don't have space for that. I don't make enough barbecue to make it worth it to install one. Or steaming whole duck. I did go out and buy like one of those 16-inch steamers, aluminum steamers that I pull out maybe once a year to steam a whole duck, but really, how often do I do that? So I've adapted some recipes where it might be easier to do in a restaurant in the most traditional way, but at home it just doesn't make sense. So there's a little bit of that. And then a little bit of adaptation for ingredients on hand. So, if you can't get to an Asian market to get yu choy or some of those other Asian greens that maybe aren't available at your neighborhood supermarket, use something that's similar. You can stir fry kale, you can stir fry a hearty lettuce. I mean, there are different ways to adapt. So I try to provide that.
Yeah, I think you do a good job of it. I actually spend most of my days driving around all the Asian markets here in Washington, D.C., trying to get all the ingredients that I need, which sometimes can be overwhelming and you can't pick up at Safeway.
Right.
Let's jump into vegetarian Chinese soul food real quick. I guess the big question is, why do this book? What was the inspiration to get to a purely vegetarian cookbook, which I applaud you for, which sometimes can be overwhelming?
I think it's not, well, definitely vegetarian, vegan, those are not dirty words, right? Like, I think there was a period of time, at least here in the United States, where vegetarianism or veganism was associated solely with kind of the crunchy granola type, stereotype. And over the years, definitely the vegetarian books have become way more beautiful, and publishers are recognizing that there is an audience for this and that they should put the same amount of effort that they would in some other general cookbook as they would into a vegetarian or vegan book. So I think there's definitely room for more of these types of books. And the other part of it was that after I did my first book, I felt like perhaps I didn't include enough straight up vegetable dishes. And my thinking on that was, in the first book, I have a dish that's just simple stir-fried greens, and it features one type of vegetable. And I say in the recipe, you can substitute any number of Asian greens for this. You can add different spices to it, etc. Here's the basic recipe, and then here you go. You can use, just add whatever you feel like you want to add. And the problem with that is, we take it for granted that we're cooks, from the sense that that I can open the refrigerator, look at what I have, and then just make something, right? Not everybody can do that, and we have to. They actually need to be able to see, okay, all right, so if I add these ingredients together, then that will make a dish, and then from there, if I don't have this particular green, I can substitute a different green. They can't just open the refrigerator and just make something up. And so I thought, okay, well, this is an opportunity to add on some other types of dishes, but also an opportunity to feature different techniques. Like, I didn't do a whole lot of steaming stuff in the first book. I didn't do, I didn't really talk about, more than a couple of different dumplings. So I pushed myself a little bit to expand my own repertoire, and then just bring people along on that. And if you took both books side by side, it's a pretty, it covers the gamut, but they also stand alone. So people who are vegetarian or vegan, and by the way, it is about 85% naturally vegan. I do have one chapter on egg dishes, and so you can use that as a guide for you. People always ask that, how much of it is vegan? It's about 85% vegan.
That's almost percentage.
Yeah, I mean, it was almost. My editor had actually asked me if I would write a vegan book, but because I wanted to include eggs, I have some favorite egg dishes that I wanted to make sure I included. I said, well, I really can't do a vegan book just for that reason. That said, I haven't tried these recipes with an egg replacer. Whenever, that'll be my next little side project, is to figure out if some of these dishes work with an egg replacer, but I haven't done it yet. So.
My mom would truly appreciate this book. They, as I guess Chinese people get older, they tend to trend towards vegetarianism. And so, yeah, vegetables are very prominent in Chinese cuisine. And Maybe if you can touch on that a little bit, because at like my home table, I think it's probably the same as your home table was, one meat dish, because that is where you spend all your money, and then a ton of rice, because that will fill your belly, and then vegetables all around it. And so if you could speak a little bit about why vegetables are just like so important and how you could fill an entire cookbook with recipes from there.
Absolutely. I mean, in general, Chinese cooking is all about balance. So it's balance between the types of dishes you include in a meal, it's the seasonality, it's texture, it's flavor. So there's a lot of considerations when you're choosing what dishes you decide to pair with one another. And they're not really hard and fast rules. I mean, there could be, you could really get into it, but I didn't want to create a barrier in that. So it's just a general thing to say that, yes, we think about all of these different types of factors when we are putting together a meal. And meat is expensive, right? So the Chinese culture is traditionally very agrarian. So there's always been lots of people grow vegetables, and vegetables are more affordable, and it gives you the variety, and there's health property, like all sorts of things, right, that are related to that. And meat's expensive. So if you got meat, it is it was a special occasion, or now you still see, like, you can look on video, and there are videos of these YouTubers basically who are like, the village butchers a pig and everybody gets a piece of this, and then they preserve it, and so it's a thing, right? Like, we don't just go to the QFC and buy a pack of meat and that's it. So yeah, I typically, because we are not strict vegetarians or anything like that, so we do tend to have one dish that is more meat centric, and then everything else, so it could be 2 or 3 other dishes, are vegetable or tofu based, and then together you have, you kind of travel the flavor spectrum and the texture spectrum, and you're right, my mother lives with us. She after my dad died, she moved in with us, and so we have 3 generations in the house. And it's true, from the and my husband's white guy, so we have this spectrum of palates at the dinner table. And yeah, my mom is almost 80 and tends to eat less meat, eats more vegetables, and the meat just becomes like a seasoning, right? So she enjoys a chicken broth, but she doesn't really eat the chicken. She might enjoy something that has just a little bit of, like, a ground pork or something that flavors the sauce, but is not really focused on eating that meat. And so, yeah, it's a different way to think about vegetables as just part of the palette of ingredients. And then just vegetarianism in general is there's so many vegetarians, whether it's because of religion or for health purposes, that Chinese people, plenty of Chinese people are into vegetarian eating. And it's nothing to be ashamed of. It's not a dirty word. It never has been, right? Like, it's just, oh, I don't eat it, or they don't eat rice, or whatever the thing is. Like, it's not, nobody gets, picked on because they eat a certain way.
I wanted to speak about food waste in Chinese cuisine just for a second. And as we're speaking about, I guess that relates all the way up to much bigger issues. But I found growing up that I would always be eating a lot of byproduct. And, I guess all the way down to my parents just putting things in my bowl, and I would be eating a piece of what I thought was Jello, but it was actually pig's blood Jello, because they didn't want to waste the blood. I don't even know what you call it in Chinese, or why somebody would do that and then put it in my bowl without telling me. But that, yes, we grew up. But and I read that you address some of that in some of your recipes, but I find Chinese cuisine to be very, what do you call it, conservative in what you throw away. And so maybe that's your next book, because it's pickling and preserving, and that's a huge part of Chinese cuisine. So speak a little bit about food waste in Chinese cuisine.
Yeah, I mean, when you have millions and millions of people who have limited resources, I mean, you're not going to waste anything. So regardless of whether it's food or other materials, you figure out how to use things and take care of things so they last a long time. You repurpose, you learn how to fix things, because they can't just go on Amazon and order everything, right? So in general, the culture is very cognizant of that. Although, nowadays with the younger generation, who knows? I mean, we're all, it's such a global society now that some of those values might be shifting. But in general, yeah, we want to be, because really the flavor is in all the bits, right? It's the flavors in the bones, it's in the roots, and it's in all the edges. And you could, there's always one more thing that you can do with the ingredients. So we'll have one example. My husband made a soup with oxtail. Oxtail already is not a prime cut. He made the soup from this Italian book, and then peeled off the meat. And then there's all the bone and the cartilage and stuff that was set aside. And my mom comes through the kitchen. She's like, do not throw those away, because I can just stir fry that with some onions and ginger and some chili peppers, and it's another meal. And literally that's what we did, right? So it's not done until it's done. And I can look at leftovers to say we have, if we get takeout or something, or roast up from the Chinese barbecue shop, you eat the meat, and then there's all these little bones left over. Guess what? That's soup, duck soup with some pickled Chinese mustard greens, So there's always, there's this general thinking about what else can I do with these ingredients so I get the absolute value out of the ingredients. Stems, the broccoli stalks, in the US, we tend to buy broccoli crowns, and the less work you have to do, the more expensive it is, right? And the stems are actually quite edible. You can stir fry them, peel them, slice them, stir fry them, pickle them, whatever you want to do. So we eat the stems, right? So it's just in general, I think if you come from a place where you're always thinking about the economics, then you tend not to waste things. And I don't think that's solely a Chinese concern. I mean, just any culture anywhere in the world where they come from scarcity, they're going to think about how they're going to use everything to the best that they can.
Yeah, I think I made the comment in the notes that I only actually ate broccoli stems growing up at home. And the only time I would actually have the florets was when we went to the American buffets, and it would be like boiled and then covered in Velveeta cheese. And, to be honest, the broccoli stems are better. So you spoke a little bit about, I wanted to get into a little bit about culture, food, and family before we get to the demo. And you spoke about having 3 generations in your house, which is amazing. I'm not sure I could live with my parents at this age and my children at the same time. That's off to you. My children are mixed as well. They're half Salvadorian and half Chinese. And actually, every niece or nephew is of mixed race now as well. And so a little bit, if you could relate this back to Taiwan, in that Taiwan was starting to mix the Chinese races. And you're starting to see that now. And so the Chinese traditions are starting to be lost. And what I did appreciate about the books was that you would speak about those things that I've heard you speak before. So speak a little bit about how you feel and how you address like the shift and the loss of Chinese traditions and how we are kind of making new ones.
You know, cultures evolve, right? So we can't expect that we would maintain all of the practices and the traditions from ancient China, right? Like, I wouldn't want feet binding. I'm glad that that ended, right? My paternal grandmother had her feet bound. I can't even wrap my head around that. Like, you know, so we want culture to evolve. And as the world evolves with technology and, you know, all of the things that change over time, we have to grow with it. So what does that mean to be from a culture that originated from, you know, for me, it's the other side of the world, right? How do I maintain whatever it was that I learned from that, and how do I pass that on? And we tell stories, right? So in my books, there are stories, especially the first one. The first one definitely has more family stories. And for me, the impetus for that book especially was to make sure that the next generation, so my children and their cousins, have some point of reference for some of these family stories, and at least some starting points to learn about the history, right? I am not a historian, you know, my book is not about 5,000 years of history, but there's at least a starting point for them. And or anybody else who maybe had a similar upbringing. Maybe they grew up in the States, born in the States, ABCs as we call them. And I found that they're actually a surprise market for my books, because they grew up with some of these recipes, but maybe they didn't actually learn how to make them. And, you know, teaching somebody how to cook is not easy for everybody. So there is this reference here that they can learn from that. And as far as losing some of the culture, it's hard. I mean, it's hard. Me growing up in the States, I think when I was younger, we were definitely, you know, and when my father was alive, we, you know, were more strict about certain practices, not wearing shoes in the house, that kind of thing. And now we're all super blended, and some of that falls to the wayside a bit. And I feel that, and I think, okay, what should I should I focus on here, right? So it would be impossible for me to translate everything. So I'm doing the best that I can, and because all of my kids and my nieces and nephews are all mixed, so they also have another culture that they have to reconcile with as well. So you know, who am I to say that the Chinese side is the dominant one, right? So it's all going to be blended, but at least with my books and my efforts, they have a starting point to explore the history. And then hopefully with that, like, you give people a starting point, and maybe one of them will take it and carry it further.
Yeah, I enjoyed reading the narratives in your book. I mean, I relate to it in very specific cases, and what you said, I think it's a great starting point, but I also appreciate that you've written it so nobody else has to, because I bet you, even like I'm an ABC, but even like, you know, people who came over when they were children can probably relate to a lot of the things that you said here. So I'm glad that you documented it, so none of us have to. It seems like
Actually, I encourage other people to document, because we all, you know, there might be some similarities and parallels, but you know, everybody's experience is their own. you know, that we can definitely connect across the parallels, and I think that's great. Like you know, when you grow up someplace where there weren't a whole lot of other people who looked like you, you start to question your identity a bit. Like, who am I? I ended up keeping my name, my birth name, and when I found out what it means, then I was more adamant about keeping it. And of course, you're going to ask, what does it mean? Hsiao-Ching. So Xiao is like daybreak or dawn. Qing is clear. So it's clear day at dawn. And I found the etymology, and it is someone who stands up high and can see everything clearly. So that is the standard to which I have to hold myself every day. I think, okay, I need to at least attempt to understand different perspectives and how that applies in any given situation, whether that's related to food or business or family. So, you know, that's one thing.
I do appreciate you did keep your name. I mean, Missouri and Arkansas were not the most friendly places to grow up in the 70s and 80s. And, you know, maybe that's why my parents called me Tim, right? So they were just like, you won't have as many problems if your name is Tim, which is, you know, American Son, which is one of the restaurants. The name American Son is actually that story itself. And, you know, my parents raised me to not lose my culture, but to not put my culture on the forefront because, you know, bricks through windows or getting beaten up and stuff like that were things that would happen to us. And so, you know, by the time I grew up, my parents would introduce me to everybody as their American son, Timmy, to make sure that other Chinese people understood that I could not speak to them in Chinese or that I did not understand the culture. So I applaud you for that and standing strong on that line. So.
That's a tough thing. Like when we visited Taiwan, I remember the first time I was in grade school and we looked different, right? We were different, the way we dressed, the way we behaved and carried ourselves, we were different. And even if we, you know, even if our faces looked like everybody else, we just they clearly identified as American. Or not having grown up in Taiwan. And that is a very weird place to be when you're in between. Like, you're not American because your face is not American, even though you grew up in the States and even though you have a blue passport, you know, so on paper I'm American, but people don't see me as an American. And then to go back to Taiwan and also and not be seen as Chinese, fully Chinese, because I grew up in the States. So it's a weird in-between place to be in. And, you know, as a teenager, you're already going through the teenage angst and all of the normal stuff. And then to add on this layer of identity, you don't know who you are. You don't know if you should, you know, Chinese culture is very patriarchal. So I was taught to be quiet because I was a girl. Glad that didn't turn out that way, but you know, it's like there's all these different layers of struggle, and then the weight of the history and, you know, all of that. So it's a tough position to be in.
I think we're at a moment of awareness in the culture in America right now. And I mean, I don't want to touch on some of the harder things that have been happening, but, you know, all the little things start to add up. And I think as we just voice more about what it is and talking about, like, yeah, I experienced the same thing, whereas we don't fit in either place with Chinese people or with Americans. But as we do things like writing these books or doing things like this and making awareness bigger, I think it actually helps our case in the long run, which is great.
Indeed.
Okay, sorry, I didn't mean that to get so serious, but I do appreciate always talking about things like that with other people that have gone through the same thing. So let's start to get into the cooking.
Yeah.
Brussels sprouts recipe.
I'm ready.
Why don't you?
I'm ready.
How easy some of this can be.
Yeah, so the dish I'm demoing is the dry fried Brussels sprouts. I don't recall what page it's on in the vegetarian book, but the idea or the inspiration, and this is one of those dishes where I did have a little bit of, uh, you know, kind of it's not traditional because it's not really what the dish is made with. It's typically with green beans. So you have the dry fried green beans. And then I wanted to take those flavors because I included the green bean recipe in the first book. So I couldn't put it in the second book and just take out the meat, you know. So I wanted to have those flavors, but then use a different type of vegetable. And I settled on Brussels sprouts. And then instead of traditionally it's a Sichuanese dish, and traditionally it's with ground beef. And we just grew up with ground pork instead of ground beef. And then for this dish, I'm using shiitake mushrooms as, not as a substitute, but as the little bits that get charred and delicious and wonderful. So I'm just going to go into, I think Tim, did you want to say something about your businesses? I'm just going to get on my knees here.
Yeah, so Lucky Danger are ode to Chinese takeout, and in your special section in the first book, it's kind of like all the recipes that we're doing well, which is like kung pao chicken and orange beef. But really, it's split into two things, and it's a little bit about this awareness talk that we were having, in that, you know, nobody has really updated Chinese American food from when it was kind of quote unquote created. Back in whenever you want to argue when it was created.
Right.
But so like kung pao, General Tso's orange beef, and so we definitely have some of those. Actually, the second half of the menu is that secret menu that you were talking about earlier, because that's how and so you see dishes where it's like, you know, seafood crispy noodles or pork belly with mustard greens,
nice, nice
radish, and so it's part of this, maybe bringing the two sides together and creating what's a new Chinese takeout. And so that we're bringing that awareness of there's this other interesting side of Chinese restaurants that I still cannot order at without my parents, which scares me. Maybe that's also selfish. Now we can do it for ourselves, but we want things. And so that's really where Lucky Danger started. It's a bigger cultural story, but also just at the surface, it's a Chinese takeout. So
that's so cool. I can't wait to when we can travel again to head to DC and check it out. Okay, so for the Brussels sprouts, I basically just took the sprout here, trimmed off the end, and then I'm slicing these. So you know, peel off any browned outer bits, and then we're just slicing these about roughly a 1/4 inch thick or so. We don't want to do it whole because when we're stir frying, we want to make sure that the ingredients are cut up such that they can be cooked very quickly over high heat, because that is the basis of stir frying. Okay. And so I had some already cut. I have got a good pile there. The other little bits are shiitake mushrooms. Now, I actually, for this, I prefer the dried shiitake mushrooms that you reconstitute. I think that the dried mushrooms have more concentrated flavor. So get a few of those. You can do fresh. I mean, I have some fresh ones here too. We'll just mix them in there. But the note is that when you do get dried shiitakes, make sure you allow for soaking time, right? Don't wait till the last minute and then all of a sudden you have these dried mushrooms that you can't use. So soak those, and then we just dice these up. So first we slice and then we cross cut them. And you can, I have kind of my hack for reconstituting mushrooms. If you have the time, just put them in some tap water and let them soak for a while. But if you don't, you could put them in a little bit of boiling water and just let them simmer for a few minutes, and then that will soften them right up. And that's been my hack for when I forget to soak my mushrooms. All right, so I've got some of these diced shiitake. I already have some chopped green onions, some minced garlic, and fresh ginger. And then the key seasonings will be just soy sauce and a touch of sugar. Soy sauce, you know, I have a, soy sauce is my soapbox, I guess. I think everybody knows Kikkoman. That is a very common brand. A lot of people know it. You probably have it in your kitchen, but there's a whole world of soy sauces out there to try, especially in Chinese cooking. So just in the second book, there's actually a little chart that talks about that. So check that out. All right, I'm going to start cooking here. First thing I want to do, and this wok, by the way, was hand hammered by an artisan in Shanghai who got gentrified out of his little workshop. So you can't buy these anymore unless somebody is selling it on eBay or something for an ungodly amount of money. But otherwise, you know, you can buy woks at a lot of different places. Get a carbon steel wok, round bottom if you have gas stove, flat if you don't. Like if you have a flat top stove, electric, induction, you name it. But just make sure that it's the right shape for your particular stove. I preheated it, and you know it's heated when wisps of smoke start to rise from the surface. And I'm doing about 2 tablespoons here of oil, and we're going to char the Brussels sprout leaves first. Let that sizzle. I don't know if you can hear that. I've got noise canceling earphones on, so it may cancel out the sizzle, but it's sizzling. And what I'm doing here is just trying to give this head start with the cooking, the heat, just a little bit of that oil, the moisture from inside of the Brussels sprouts will start to release. And here we just want to give this a couple minutes to get a little bit of that char going. So when I do this for green beans, you know, I do kind of a flash fry with the green beans to get the skin sprinkled. I didn't want to do that with the Brussels sprouts, so I just am letting the heat of this hot carbon steel kind of help make that first layer of flavor. And I have a pretty high-powered gas stove, so it doesn't take me a whole lot of time, but for your stove, it may take you an extra minute or so, depending on the power of the heat. So just adjust accordingly. Let me grab something to put my char bits in. All right, so I'm going to turn off the heat here. And this is a little bit of that adaptation, right? In a restaurant, as you know, Tim, like you're doing this even faster. You're not spending the same amount of time that I would at home because very different scale of heat. Okay.
Yeah, we get a dish out every like 10 seconds at this point. So
exactly.
That goes pretty fast.
Exactly. It's a lot of heat.
Relates to what you're doing right now. Someone wanted to sub out beef for the mushrooms that you're about to cook. How much should they sub and how should they integrate it?
If they wanted to do beef instead of mushrooms?
Correct.
Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just a little bit. So I would say maybe I don't know, 1/4 to 1/2 cup of meat. If you were doing ground beef, for example, you could do that. If you're doing sliced beef, that's a different thing, different type of recipe. And right now I'm just kind of cooking the mushrooms a bit. I'm going to add all of my aromatics. And by the way, if you are watching closely and trying to match this with the specific recipe at home, I don't really cook from recipes, and so sometimes I do things out of order from my own recipes. And really close observers are like, wait a minute, you said this, but you did this. So forgive me on that. So I've added all of my ingredients together. Stir frying that around. And then let me crank up the heat a bit here. I'm adding the soy sauce. And that really is just smelling incredible. And then just a touch of sugar to help get some of that caramelization going. And if you don't want to add sugar, you know, if you're avoiding sugar or whatever, you can totally skip that part. But just that hint of sugar, it's not so much to make it sweet, but it's to balance it out a little bit and to create some of the kind of that extra caramelization in here. Oh my gosh, this smells amazing. I wish we had smell-o-vision and taste-o-vision. You could serve this at Thanksgiving instead of, you know, instead of whatever other Brussels sprout preparation you do. But it, you know, that really didn't take very long at all. It only took as long as it did because I was talking through it. But here's the finished dish. Check that out. It smells really wonderful. We've got the smokiness from the soy sauce and the mushrooms, and when the heat just you know, kind of mixes all that together, it's really, really wonderful flavors. So that is the fried Brussels sprouts.
I think it's great because also it's like a alternative use for an alternative way to cook Brussels sprouts, because it's popular among restaurant menus right now where it's deep fried Brussels sprouts, and it's always deep fried Brussels sprouts with like mayonnaise. And so I love seeing it in a different interpretation that's like super fresh and just not fried.
Yeah. And it's really fabulous. And my husband, who cannot stand Brussels sprouts, was, you know, when I told him that I was doing this, he's like, oh, no. But then he tasted it, and now he's a convert.
Is he also the cameraman?
He is. He's actually a TV producer. So the reason why my kitchen is well lit is because of him. We have like professional lights and you know, different camera setups and things like that. Gimbals, multiple gimbals, things that I wouldn't necessarily have known about. But you know, it's good to be married to a TV producer.
So at this point, I want to like open up if there's questions. People can type the questions into the chat, and we'll ask them as we go along. So the first question that I have is, any suggestions on how to sub out oyster sauce that's used a lot in Chinese cooking?
Well, don't use it. And then, you know, oftentimes the dishes that are built around a specific flavor, you know, you can, you know, maybe use hoisin if they're not one-to-one exchanges. I know that there is apparently a recipe out there that I think Andrea Nguyen, she's a Vietnamese cookbook author, was trying to work out some sort of vegetarian oyster sauce. So there might be a recipe out there floating around for that. But what I tend to do is, if there is a flavor that I don't like or can't have, then I pick a different ingredient. Like, it's not about trying to approximate that given dish. It's like, okay, well, what are the ingredients I can actually use? What is the core principle behind that recipe, and how do I make something like it, but you know, it's not exactly that dish. So depending on the dish, so I don't know specifically what dish this person was referring to, but say, for example, in dim sum restaurants, they do the steamed Chinese broccoli, gailan, and often that's served with oyster sauce. I have something that I do, I think, with hoisin sauce, right? So I don't use oyster sauce for that. And it's delicious. It's hoisin sauce instead. Oh, I know. It says there, I have a stir fry of Chinese broccoli with oyster mushrooms, and I use hoisin in that. So, and those do come vegetarian.
I've also seen some people use, there's like a mushroom quote unquote oyster sauce that I've never used it, but some people have used it to some success. But
yeah, I mean, there are always those types of substitute ingredients. So, for example, if you have gluten issues, you can't necessarily have traditional soy sauce. So maybe you're using gluten-free tamari, or you're using, nowadays they have the aminos, liquid aminos, coconut aminos, or the Bragg one that I don't really like that one. The coconut aminos are okay, but the coconut aminos are a little bit sweeter. So you use the ingredients that you need to use, but just note that if something like a coconut amino is a little bit sweeter, then that is going to affect the sweetness in your dish. And if it's a dish that's not meant to have sweetness, or if it has sweetness and you add this thing that is already sweet, then maybe you want to take out the sugar, right? So there are some adaptations that you have to do. I just don't want people to think, it's kind of like the whole gluten-free thing. They wanted exact representations of the things that have gluten in them. And it's like, well, it's not necessarily about that, right? Like you have to figure out what you can make and appreciate it from that lens.
I think you said it earlier, it's balance. And I think you allude to that a lot in terms of whatever you do end up doing, just figure out the balance. Mm-hmm. I had a question about the favorite markets here in DC for Chinese stuff. It's probably the same actually around the country now as we start to become like, I don't know, everybody's the same. But Great Wall, 99 Ranch in Fairfax,
yeah.
Good Fortune and Eden. We all have the same, and they all have a central core of the same products. And you probably experienced this in Seattle, but when you start to get out into the fringes of what you need for a particular cuisine, you have to go to those specific markets.
That's true.
One of the questions is, what's your next book?
I have thoughts about that, but I probably don't want to reveal it yet. I think that the thing that I had wanted to talk about, which is harder to talk about in book form, is how I actually cook at home, which is open the refrigerator and see what I have and then make dishes from that. I know other authors have tried to do books or recipes that are based on that, and it's always a hard sell, I think. And so my challenge to myself is to figure out, is there a way that I can convey that, but still make it function like a cookbook that people are familiar with, and bring them along on that? Like, how do I create an on-ramp to that kind of cooking, right? Where you're not starting with the recipe, but you're starting with what you have. And what people have is going to be different on any given day. So how do you teach people the way to do that? So, because often if you look at my Instagram, often I'll post pictures of dishes that I'll make for my mom, and they are things that there's no recipe for them. They're just, okay, I happen to have this and I have this. Oh, I will do this with it. Or if I add just a little bit of something, I have this really great, soothing, comforting dish. So you'll see some of that represented in some of my Instagram, but I think I'm just trying to figure out how I can make that into a marketable book.
What I enjoyed most about both books, other than the narratives, the second thing was actually the front part where you started to talk about ingredients and techniques and equipment. And so I feel like you're onto something with maybe a toolkit, like a Chinese toolkit kind of thing.
Sure.
And,
yeah.
I really did enjoy those books. And even when you start to talk about balance and, substitutions and all those things is really training someone towards just having a skill set that they can use to do what you're saying, just cook out of the fridge, which is, there's a question, or not a question, would love to hear more about the soy sauce tasting process that you went through for the book, or the soapbox, as you so called it.
Yeah, so for the book, and I actually did this tasting when I was writing the first book, but it didn't quite end up in the first book the way that I thought it would. And so it was just more content for a follow-up. But what I did was I have a friend who's a sommelier. She's certified wine sommelier, and invited her over. I had a whole, I can't remember, because I didn't include all of them in the chart, but I had, 20 some odd different types of soy sauce, different brands, different thicknesses, things like that. And we tasted all of them raw, like straight from the bottle in a spoon. Yes, we drank a lot of water. And took notes, like flavor notes. So I, with my untrained, I don't have the wine lingo that my friend did, but I have other types of language. So we both took notes. She took notes from her perspective as knowing flavors in wine. And then I just kind of collected that and put that in, into this list. We also did a cooked version. So like for each of those soy sauces, we tasted them in crystal wine glasses, and then I had them cooked as well. So I just poured a little bit into a hot wok and then took that out, and we took spoonfuls of that just to see what they would taste like uncooked and then cooked, because the heat changes the nature of the flavor. And that's what's represented in the graph that's in book 2. And for me, it's not to say there is one best soy sauce, right? It's just show people there are differences. And just because your supermarket serves up the most common mass market brands doesn't mean that you can't go outside of that, right? And that said, I never want the lack of a certain brand or a certain type of soy sauce to be a barrier. So if all you can get wherever you live is whatever the house brand of the grocery store is, then use that. That's totally fine. And then when you have the opportunity to go outside of that, try something else. Because if you talk to different Chinese people, they'll tell you what soy sauce they grew up with, and that's the one that they use. And they're all different. And the one that I grew up with is no longer made, so I can't use that. And I had to explore, taste through, find some different ones. And it's been fun to explore that. But also, from Asian cuisine to Asian cuisine, the soy sauce flavor profiles differ. So there's, multiple worlds to explore where that's concerned.
Yeah, I typically go by the adage: you get what you pay for, you get what you're used to, and then you'll be fine. I had one last question. Your stance on MSG in Chinese cooking?
Okay, so glutamates exist naturally in a lot of foods, and that's the whole umami flavor. And I think when they labeled it as umami, it became a trendy word, and they're like, oh yeah, when you have Western chefs, you're like, this has umami, and it becomes trendy, and then people accept it. But MSG is it's like salt. You add a little bit of that, and some people have reactions to it. But people have reactions to all sorts of ingredients. So we were plagued by that in when we were in our restaurant. People just had this perception. They like, oh, don't include MSG. And maybe some of them, I imagine some of them did actually have a need for that. And then others were just saying it because that was the thing to say. And it was very frustrating, right? So for me, regardless of the ingredient, if you like it, if you like the flavor and you don't have any health issues related to it, use it, right? Like, I'm not going to judge you if you use it. I have a bottle of it at home. I don't put it in every time, just once in a while when it strikes me. My mom definitely would use it more if she were cooking a lot. That's just her habit. But you know, it's hidden in so many other products, you just don't even know it, right? And that's the yumminess. That's why you can't just eat one chip. It's like, that's the thing that makes it delicious.
I'm glad you don't judge, because I get it by like, you know, the 50-pound bag at this point. So
oh yeah, we used to. I mean, we used to in the restaurant.
I don't think there's any more questions, so I wanted to thank you, Hsiao-Ching, for doing this conversation. I know we ran over the hour, but we kept it under the 90 minutes. And I was very happy to do this with you virtually, but hopefully next time we can do this in person and we get to taste what you're cooking, which would be amazing.
Thank you so much. Thank you to you, Tim, and thanks for all your amazing questions, and to Clementine and Bulwark for hosting. This is amazing. We were chatting before, and you know, I'm not a famous enough cookbook author that the publisher would send me on a tour to DC, but through Zoom, I get to join you all there. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you, Hsiao-Ching. Hsiao-Ching, you always have a home in DC with us next time you're touring for your new book. Everybody, don't forget to purchase your copy of Vegetarian Chinese Soul Food. And we also have copies of Hsiao-Ching's first book, Chinese Soul Food, here at the shop. Thank you all so very much for joining, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Thanks so much.